Hello, family, and welcome. We're Bob and Penny Lord, and we have a very special super saint to share with you today, St. Charles Borromeo, Bishop, Cardinal, and Defender of the Faith.
We speak about holy clusters, about holy coincidences, and we know that there is no such thing as coincidences except by the Lord's design. Right near the Swiss border, where Calvinism was to begin and to spread like a deadly plague, we find God raising up in the 16th century a saint to counteract what Calvin will be doing and what Calvin is doing, rather.
Now, we are on the beautiful, what they call the Lago Maggiore in northern Italy, in the little town of Arona, which is where St. Charles Borromeo was born. He came from a very well-to-do family, and he was born just at the time when things were getting very difficult with Martin Luther. And so his home was constantly filled with bishops and cardinals and priests. His family was a very religious family. In back of us, you can see the castle in which he was born. And although he came from a well-to-do family, and his family was always part of the in-group of the church, he never considered himself above anybody. If anything, he wanted to give what he had away so that he could be more like the people.
And he did. When he became Archbishop, he gave away all his goods. He gave everything away to the poor, the indigent, those who had nothing for themselves. He chose to live an austere life.
Now, he was as a young man, which is where he spent his time here, he was a very quiet young man, very studious, very religious, and yet for those of you who may have children who are a little, you might call them slow, Charles Borromeo was slow in speech, slow in thinking, and yet he's a brilliant member of our church. He instituted so many reforms within the church, and yet this was a man, as a young man and as a boy, that they were concerned about him because he was very slow thinking, very slow speaking, responding. He had a slight voice impediment. Speech impediment. So, you know, you have no idea, you parents who think you may have hearing impaired or speech impaired children, they could become something beautiful for the Lord.
And again, when they tell us that the quality of our life is not one that is worth preserving, when they do sonograms on unborn children and decide that these children are going to be of no use to themselves or to the world, when they want to put children like Charles Borromeo, into an institution, how foolish they are. Here is one of the greats of the church. He instituted more of what we use today in the church than almost any saint. Again, a contradiction in the world. A rich man, a noble, a Medici. Now, we hear so much terrible about a Medici, and here was a great Medici, a generous Medici, who brought about the true reform. So what do we have here? Right across, very close, bordering on this village, we have what they call the Reformation, and we say more aptly, the Revolution. And here was born part of the Counter-Reformation.
One of the four saints who are attributed with fighting the most for the Counter-Reformation of Luther and Calvin. Calvinism began right across from here in Switzerland, a devastating effect on the church and on the people of Switzerland. It was the most brutal form of tyranny we've ever heard about in our entire life, and yet the Lord right near there brought a young man into the world who would be a powerful member of our church. He was a very powerful saint. Many miracles took place through the intercession of Charles Borromeo, and none of us know much about him. Well, now we're going to learn a lot about Charles Borromeo.
The CCD program that you go to
was instituted by Charles Borromeo.
The seminaries instituted by Charles Borromeo. So much of the wealth of the church. We were speaking with our bishop the other day, and he was thanking God that he has now an auxiliary bishop, because he goes to visit every single parish, and our diocese is extremely large geographically. And he goes to every single parish. Now, the two bishops do. Imagine in the time of Charles Borromeo, when he instituted this practice.
And when they were going by horse and carriage.
And by foot. He did travel one time all the way down to Torino by foot. And from Milan to Torino was a tremendous distance. If a bishop wanted to visit all the parishes in his diocese during the time of Charles Borromeo, it could possibly take his entire life, and he still may never get it done. So this is what this man set out to do. He was truly a man of the church.
Praise you, Jesus.
Praise you, Jesus.
At 12 years old, Charles received the clerical tonsure and was given a Benedictine abbey in Arona by his uncle Julius Caesar Borromeo. Charles looked upon this gift as more a responsibility than a means of adding to his personal wealth. As young as he was, he made a point of using the income from the property solely for the maintenance of the abbey, his religious education, and the care of the poor and the homeless.
It's amazing, family, when you look at the opulence of this castle where Charles Borromeo lived, that it didn't mean anything to him. He gave every part of it away. For a while, he was the custodian or the executor of the estate, and he had to run everything, pay all the bills, and finally he just couldn't handle it anymore, so he gave it over to his brother. He didn't want anything to do with finances or any of that part of the castle.
When you look at the long line of cardinals and bishops and popes who came from the Borromeo family, when you look at the paintings of those who visited here, you see this long line, this heritage that brought us this powerful saint and defender of the faith.
Charles, a model student, fought the label of being slow by excelling in his studies. He showed great strength, imposing the most stringent demands upon himself. Because of his prudent behavior and demeanor, he was held up to other students as an example of chastity, which was badly lacking in the university. He obtained his doctorate in civil and canon law at 22 years old. His uncle, a Medici cardinal archbishop, upon being elected pope, made him a cardinal deacon before making him a priest, as well as administrator of the Archdiocese of Milan, who had been without an archbishop for some time.
Charles was ready to assume his role in the Archdiocese of Milan. However, his uncle, the Pope, had other ideas. He brought him down to Rome to work at the Vatican. In Charles, the Pope knew he had someone he could trust, someone who had the reputation of getting the job done.
Although Charles did not know why he was needed there, the Lord did. He had to be in this key position during a crucial time. The Council of Trent had opened in 1545, adjourned in 1547, then convened again 1551, only to be adjourned after 1 year. The work never completed. It was never brought to conclusion. None of the reforms doctrines had been instituted. Until and unless all the reforms, dogmas, doctrines, and declarations were formalized, the whole Martin Luther controversy would still be up in the air. Until the questions raised by him and his fellow heretics were answered definitively, their errors clearly condemned, dissidents would use this to lure the innocent away from Mother Church. It was unquestionably one of the most important councils the Church had ever convened.
To understand the Pope's problem in 1552, Pope Julius III and his people were victims of strong pressure by the German princes. Protestants had been invited to the council in the spirit of reconciliation, but their demands were so ridiculous it was impossible to concede to them. They insisted that resolutions that had already been made by the council, especially those regarding the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist and the doctrine of transubstantiation should be revised so as to be based solely on the Protestant interpretation of Scripture, and that the Pope had to agree to be subordinate to the Council. In addition, war broke out between France and Germany. The bishops left the Council and never returned.
The Council had arrived at only fragmentary results, dogmas left incomplete. Only a fraction of the controversies with the Protestants had been doctrinally resolved. Still less satisfactory were reform decrees, leaving unanswered urgent petitions by the bishops. In 1553, Pope Julius III had prepared an extensive reform bull to cope with the many unresolved practical problems, but he died before it could be published. When Pope Pius IV, Charles' uncle, was elected pope, he vowed that he would reopen the council and bring it to conclusion. He had good reason for this. Calvinism was running rampant, not only in Switzerland, where Calvin had begun, but now was threatening France. The Pope's relative, Catherine de' Medici, the regent of France, very weak, taking a stand against Calvinism, vacillated back and forth almost on a daily basis.
Pope Pius IV knew he needed a general council to get the church at large to support the Council of Trent's stand on Protestantism. He also knew the amount of infighting that would be involved in putting together a council, whether it be to continue the Council of Trent or convene a new council. He needed a Charles Borromeo to make it happen. Charles had everything needed to get the job done. First and foremost, loyalty. The Pope knew his nephew was behind him completely, not because of their relationship, but because Charles supported the Pope's efforts to turn the tide of Protestantism, which was overtaking Europe. And secondly, he persevered until the job was completely done to the glory of God and the salvation of the church.
10 years after the previous council had been adjourned, the final sessions opened. Charles Borromeo was placed in charge of overseeing the council. It almost fell apart on a daily basis, but together with the other members of the council, he wrote the dogmas and decrees needed to complete the council's mission. It has been attested to that Charles Borromeo was the single most important factor behind the successful implementation of the goals of the Council of Trent in 1562.
The following year, he was ordained a priest, and within a matter of months, bishop. The council concluded. He prayed he would now be able to go to Milan and run his archdiocese. Bishops living at the papal court in Rome had become a touchy subject the last 2 years of the Council of Trent. To breach this subject would appear to be going against the Pope's wishes. Pope Pius IV's thinking was also that of the popes before him, that travel between Rome and his diocese was long and arduous.
In addition, the Pope needed the bishops to be there in Rome by his side for quick decision-making, but mostly for loyalty. He had to ensure they were not plotting against him, running their diocese as their own little kingdom. What would it take for the local prince or emperor to pressure them into disloyalty and disobedience to the Pope? And how long would it take before the Vatican was aware of such a betrayal?
Pope Pius IV was adamant about St. Charles staying at the papal court in Rome. This particular council, possibly one of the most important in the history of the Church, had to be followed up. As a supplement to the council, works he was directly involved in were Revised Index of Forbidden Books in 1564, Roman Catechism for Pastors in 1566, the Reformed Roman Breviary in 1568, and the Reformed Roman Missal in 1570.
While Charles was not involved in every aspect of these works, he had a hand in all of them. He was particularly involved in the drawing up of the Catechism and in major liturgical reform, but he felt a great pull to Milan and pressed his uncle to allow him to go there at least for a visitation. Finally, the Pope gave in and allowed him to go just for a visitation.